The country club was quiet that late afternoon until Rebecca Hawley, the Millionaire CEO known for her ruthless coldness, stopped in the middle of the hall and saw something that would shake her world forever. There, at a simple table, was an ex-Marine in worn flannel, cutting his daughter's food with steady, gentle hands, smiling as if that moment was all that mattered. What happened next shocked the entire conservative elite of that community and changed 4 lives forever. This is a story about honor, sacrifice, integrity, and the quiet strength that builds true families. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, comment on how you felt, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the values that built America. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning. The sunset fell over the country club as it always did in that part of the county, soft, golden, full of silent promises of order and prosperity. Traditional families walked across the fine gravel parking lot, greeting each other with polite nods and measured smiles, every gesture carrying the weight of a reputation built over generations. American flags waved lazily on tall poles, while the muffled sound of conversation and silverware echoed from the main dining hall. There, in that community of deep roots and even deeper values, everything had its place. Everything followed an invisible code known to everyone. And everyone knew that breaking that code came at a high cost. Rebecca Hawley walked through the main entrance with the posture of someone carrying the world on her shoulders, yet refusing to bend. Her impeccable, tailored suit reflected the absolute control she exercised over every detail of her own life. The firm click of her heels against the marble floor announced her arrival before anyone even saw her. Beside her, Luke walked in silence, eyes down, hands stuffed in the pockets of dress pants he clearly hated wearing. Rebecca didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She knew her son was there, playing the expected role, just as he always did. Just as she always did. The stiffness between them wasn't hostility. It was just the only way they knew how to exist beside each other. Margaret Holt was the first to greet her. President of the Chamber of Commerce, a woman with a sharp smile and an even sharper gaze. She was the type of person who could destroy a reputation with a well-placed comment during afternoon tea. Her words were always polite, but Rebecca knew how to recognize poison wrapped in silk. They exchanged formal greetings, polite smiles, and Rebecca moved on, feeling the weight of those eyes watching her even after she turned her back. That was how it worked there. Appearance, reputation, control. Slipping up was not an option, showing weakness even less so. And Rebecca Hawley had no intention of giving anyone the pleasure of seeing her stumble. It was then that she saw him. Sitting at a simple table near the window overlooking the lawn was a man who didn't fit that scene of discreet luxury and calculated conversations. James Carter wore a slightly worn flannel shirt, clean jeans without luxury, and boots that had seen too many roads to impress any member of that elite. His posture, however, was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, straight spine, steady hands resting on the table. It wasn't arrogance. It was the posture of a man who had served, who had seen the world beyond those white fences and trimmed lawns. And beside him, laughing at something he had just said, was a girl with brown hair, bright eyes, and an open, contagious smile. Rebecca stopped, not intentionally, not because she wanted to, but something in that scene held her in place as if an invisible hand had grabbed her shoulder. She saw the way James leaned in slightly to listen to his daughter, how his eyes lit up when she spoke, how he touched her hand with a tenderness that seemed as natural as breathing. There was no rush, no cell phone on the table, no assistants, meetings, or appointments to keep. There was just a father and a daughter, sharing a simple dinner, laughing together, existing together. And Rebecca felt something strange move inside her chest. Something she no longer knew how to name. Luke tugged at his mother's sleeve, bringing her back. Rebecca blinked, straightened her shoulders, and headed to their reserved table, ignoring the uncomfortable tightness that insisted on staying. She sat with her usual elegance, arranged the napkin on her lap, and flipped through the menu without really reading it. Luke did the same, in silence, staring at the empty plate in front of him as if expecting food to appear on its own. They didn't talk, they didn't laugh, they didn't touch. They just occupied the same space, each locked in their own world, performing the hollow ritual they called a family dinner. Across the room, Grace Carter laughed out loud, not caring who was listening. She was telling a story about school, gesturing with her hands, eyes wide with enthusiasm. James listened to every word as if it were the most important thing in the world. Occasionally, he interrupted to ask a question, to laugh along, to share something that made her laugh even more. There was no formality there. No weight, no masks, just life, just presence. Just uncomplicated, honest, real love. And that echoed through the hall in a way Rebecca couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. The waiter brought the appetizer. Rebecca thanked him with a dry nod, cut a small piece, and chewed without tasting. Luke poked at his food with his fork, pushing pieces from one side to the other, clearly not hungry. No one spoke. The silence between them was so dense it seemed to occupy the space like a third person. Rebecca knew she should say something. Ask about school, about friends, about anything, but the words didn't come. Or maybe she simply didn't know how to form them anymore. There were so many meetings, so many reports, so many decisions to make, that at the end of the day, when she looked at her son, all that was left was exhaustion and guilt. Always guilt. Then Luke looked to the side. His eyes landed on the table where James and Grace were dining, and for a moment, something changed in his face. It wasn't envy. It wasn't anger. It was something sadder, deeper. It was recognition. As if he saw something there that he knew he would never have. Rebecca followed her son's gaze and felt her chest tighten again. She saw James's hand on his daughter's shoulder. She saw the smile he gave when passing her the salt shaker. She saw the way Grace rested her head on her father's shoulder for a second, just because she could, just because he was there. And Rebecca understood, with painful clarity, that power, money, reputation, none of it mattered in that moment. Because she had everything. And at the same time, she had nothing. Dinner ended in silence. Rebecca paid the bill, stood up, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and walked toward the exit with Luke by her side. When she passed James and Grace's table, she didn't look directly, but she felt it. She felt the warmth of that small island of humanity in the middle of a cold sea of etiquette and appearance. She felt the quiet strength of that man wearing flannel in an elite club who didn't seem to care what people thought of him. She felt the pure joy of that girl who didn't know what it was like to live under the weight of impossible expectations. And when Rebecca walked out the door, breathing the fresh night air, she knew something had changed. She didn't know what. She didn't know how. But she knew that meeting, that clash of two worlds, had left a crack in her armor. And she didn't know if she could ever close it again. The next morning arrived like all the others, punctual, relentless, full of appointments that Rebecca kept with the precision of a clock. She woke up before the alarm, dressed in the dark so as not to wake Luke, and went down to the kitchen where the coffee was already programmed to be ready. The house was big, silent, impeccably decorated, and completely void of life. Every room seemed to exist only to be admired, not inhabited. Rebecca drank her coffee standing up, looking out the window at the perfectly manicured garden, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had followed her since the night before. That image of the ex-Marine and his daughter wouldn't leave her head, and that bothered her more than she was willing to admit. In the office, the pressure started early. Margaret Holt called before 9 in the morning with that sweet, sharp voice that always brought bad news disguised as concern. There were questions about the company, vague comments about instability, subtle questions about Rebecca's ability to maintain leadership in such challenging times. They weren't direct accusations. They never were. But the message was clear. The community was watching. And any sign of weakness would be noticed, commented on, used. Rebecca hung up the phone with her jaw clenched, feeling the familiar weight of expectation crushing her shoulders. She had built all of this alone. But alone was also how she would have to defend it. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, James Carter woke up to the sound of his daughter laughing in the next room. He smiled before even opening his eyes. Grace had a gift for turning any morning into something better, just by existing. James got up, made the simple breakfast they had together every day, and sat at the small kitchen table while she talked nonstop about the day before. She mentioned the club, mentioned the boy she saw alone at the next table, mentioned how sad he looked. James listened in silence, chewing slowly, knowing exactly who she was talking about. He had noticed too. He had seen the coldness between mother and son. And he had sensed something he knew too well, absence disguised as presence. Grace finished her breakfast and ran to get her backpack, and James stood alone in the kitchen for a few minutes. He looked around at the modest house they called home, at the furniture that wasn't new but was enough, at the photos on the fridge showing real smiles and simple moments. He had left a lot behind when he left the Marine Corps. Career, recognition, the adrenaline of military life. But he had gained something no rank or medal could give. Time. Time to be present. Time to watch his daughter grow. Time to be the kind of father he never had. And looking at those photos, he knew he had made the right choice. Later that same day, Grace and Luke met by chance at the playground near the school. Luke was sitting alone on the swing, pushing himself slowly with his feet, looking at the ground. Grace approached with the natural confidence of someone who never learned to be afraid of making friends. She asked if he wanted to play. Luke looked at her surprised, as if no one had asked that question in a long time. And then, for the first time in weeks, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was real. And it was enough for Grace to decide right there that he would be her friend. She didn't know she was building a bridge between two worlds. She just knew that boy needed someone. And she liked being that someone. Rebecca learned about the new friendship through a text from the nanny, who mentioned in passing that Luke had come home talking about a girl named Grace. The name echoed in Rebecca's mind like a distant bell. Grace, the ex-Marine's daughter. The girl who laughed loudly without worrying about judgment. Rebecca didn't know how to feel about it. Part of her was relieved to see her son making friends. Part of her felt a strange pang of ... something. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more as if Grace offered her son something she herself couldn't offer. Lightness, spontaneity, joy without conditions. And that hurt in a way Rebecca wasn't prepared to process. Meanwhile, on a high floor of Rebecca's corporate building, Richard Graves watched everything with the cold gaze of someone who knows how to wait for the right moment. Director of corporate security, he controlled information, access, reports. And recently, he had started noticing interesting patterns. The CEO was distracted, making small mistakes, making emotional decisions. And for a man like Graves, that wasn't just a weakness. It was an opportunity. He opened a folder on his computer, reviewed some documents, and began to craft a plan. It didn't need to be aggressive. It didn't need to be fast. It just needed to be strategic. Plant doubts, feed rumors, create a climate of instability. And then, when the time was right, offer himself as the solution. Julia Bennett, the internal communications coordinator, was the first piece Graves decided to move. She was young, competent, loyal to the CEO, but also vulnerable. She had debts. She had insecurities. She was afraid of losing her job. Graves called her for a private meeting, mentioned concerns about the company, suggested it would be smart to ensure she was on the right side when things changed. It wasn't a direct threat. It never was. But Julia understood. And when she left that room, she knew something was wrong. She knew she should tell Rebecca, but fear spoke louder. And she stayed silent. That night, James took Grace for a walk around the neighborhood. They passed in front of the country club, now closed, lit only by the exterior lights casting long shadows on the lawn. Grace asked if they would go back there. James said maybe someday. She then mentioned Luke, said he seemed lonely, asked if his father didn't like him. James stopped, crouched down to his daughter's level, and explained carefully that sometimes people don't know how to show love. That sometimes adults carry so much weight they forget how to be light. That it didn't mean they didn't love, just that they were lost. Grace listened attentively and then asked if they could help. James smiled, touched his daughter's face tenderly, and said that maybe so. Maybe they could. Rebecca, alone in her home office, stared at the computer screen without really seeing anything. The numbers were there, the reports were there, the decisions waiting to be made were there. But everything seemed distant, blurry, irrelevant. She thought about her son, about the silence that lived between them, about the way he had looked at that ex-Marine and his daughter as if he were seeing something impossible. And for the first time in years, Rebecca allowed herself to ask a question she had always avoided. What was she really building? An empty empire? A reputation without a foundation? A legacy no one would miss when she was gone? The question hung in the air, unanswered, heavy as lead. And Rebecca turned off the computer, walked up the stairs in silence, and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of vulnerability for the first time in a long, long time. Richard Graves had a simple rule: never act in haste. Patience was the most powerful weapon a man in his position could have, and he knew it better than anyone. Sitting in his office at the top of the corporate building, overlooking the impeccable suburb stretching beyond the glass windows, he reviewed the reports with the meticulousness of a surgeon. There were small inconsistencies in the numbers, nothing alarming, nothing Rebecca Hawley couldn't explain. But in the right hands, with the right narrative, those inconsistencies could turn into something much bigger. They could turn into doubt. And doubt, in a community like that, was like poison in the water, slow, invisible, lethal. The first move was subtle. Graves called a strategic meeting with a few board members, casually mentioning his concerns about the direction the company was taking. He didn't accuse Rebecca directly. He didn't need to. He just planted questions. Was she handling the pressure well? Did recent decisions reflect the kind of leadership the company needed? Did the community trust her like before? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, exactly as he had planned. And when the meeting ended, Graves knew the seeds were planted. Now he just had to wait for them to grow. Julia Bennett left that meeting with a knot in her stomach. She had been called to present internal communication reports, but what really happened was something entirely different. Graves had put her in the center of a conversation she didn't want to have. They asked questions about the CEO's stability, about internal rumors, about employee morale. Julia answered honestly, but she felt every word being twisted, molded, used as ammunition. When she got back to her desk, she knew she had made a mistake. She didn't know exactly what, but she knew something was wrong. And worst of all, she was too afraid to tell Rebecca, afraid of losing her job, afraid of being seen as disloyal, afraid of being wrong about everything. Rebecca started feeling the shift before she even understood what was happening. Meetings got tenser, looks got heavier, questions got sharper. Margaret Holt called more often, always with that sweet voice loaded with feigned concern, always mentioning what people were saying. Rebecca tried to maintain composure, answer firmly, show control. But inside, something was crumbling. She felt like she was holding up a wall that was cracking on all sides, and no matter how hard she tried to patch them, new cracks kept appearing. And the worst part was she couldn't stop thinking about that night at the club, about that ex-Marine, about that daughter, about that feeling that she was losing something she never had. James Carter wasn't a man to meddle in problems that weren't his. He had learned, over his years in the Marine Corps, that sometimes the best strategy was to observe, analyze, wait. But he had also learned to recognize patterns. And lately, whenever he took Grace to the club or passed through the corporate area of the suburb, he noticed something strange. Rebecca Hawley looked different, tenser, more distant, more fragile. He saw her walking hurriedly, phone always glued to her ear, shoulders more hunched than they should be. And although it wasn't his problem, James couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Something that went beyond business. Something that smelled like manipulation. Grace and Luke were spending more and more time together. They met at the playground, in the school library, sometimes at the club when both families were there. Grace talked nonstop, telling stories, asking questions, laughing loudly. Luke listened, answered slowly, smiled occasionally. It was as if she were bringing light to a place that had been dark for too long. James watched from afar, proud of his daughter, but also worried. He saw the way Luke looked at his own world, with caution, with fear, with the sadness of someone who had already learned not to expect much, and that hurt. Because James knew exactly what it was like to grow up like that. And he didn't wish that on anyone, much less a child. The rumors started almost imperceptibly. A conversation here, a comment there, always vague enough not to be confronted, but specific enough to cause damage. I heard the company isn't doing well. It seems the CEO is distracted lately. Does she really have what it takes to lead in times like these? Margaret Holt was a master at spreading these doubts. She didn't need to invent anything. Just repeat, with the right intonation, at the right moment, to the right people. And in a small community, where reputation was everything, that was enough to start a fire that would burn slow, but burn completely. Rebecca felt the weight of the gossip like a punch to the gut. She was at the club, waiting for Luke, when she heard two women talking near the entrance. They didn't see her. Or maybe they did and didn't care. They were talking about the company, about weak leadership, about how worrying it was to see a woman who was supposed to be strong falling apart bit by bit. Rebecca stood paralyzed, fingernails digging into her palms, breath caught in her throat. She wanted to turn around, face those women, demand they prove anything they were saying, but she couldn't move. Because deep down, a part of her was afraid they were right. That she really was losing control. That everything she had fought for was slipping through her fingers. That same night, James was sitting on the living room couch, Grace asleep in the next room, when he received an unexpected call. It was an old friend from his service days, someone who now worked in corporate security in another city. The conversation was casual at first, but then the friend mentioned something that made James sit up straighter. He mentioned he had heard about internal manipulations at a local company, mentioned the name Richard Graves, mentioned tactics James knew too well. Disinformation, psychological pressure, narrative control. And although the friend didn't know the specific details, James connected the dots quickly. Something was happening. And Rebecca Hawley was at the center of it. And if he was right, she had no idea what she was facing. The week ended with Rebecca alone in her office, looking at the pile of reports she needed to review, feeling the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes on her. She had built all that. She had fought, sacrificed, bled for that company, for that reputation, for that place in the community. But now, for the first time, she wondered if it was worth it. If all that control, all that stiffness, all that loneliness, really led her anywhere that mattered. And when she closed her eyes, the image that appeared wasn't of success or power. It was of a simple ex-Marine, sitting with his daughter, laughing, present, whole. And Rebecca realized with painful clarity that while she fought to hold on to an empire that was crumbling, he had something she would never have: peace. The reports arrived at Rebecca's desk on a Monday morning, stacked in a way that looked innocent, but carried enough weight to crush any hope she still had that things would calm down. She opened the first document and felt her stomach sink. There were distorted numbers, conclusions that made no sense, interpretations that seemed deliberately designed to make her look incompetent. They weren't direct lies. They were half-truths, and those were the most dangerous. Rebecca ran her fingers over the data, trying to understand how this had left her department, how it had been approved, how it had reached the board's hands without her knowing. And then she realized Richard Graves. He had access to everything. He controlled the flow of information, and he was using it against her. Margaret Holt wasted no time. That same afternoon, she called, and this time the feigned concern was sharper, more insistent. She mentioned the reports, mentioned conversations she'd had with other members of the business community, mentioned the importance of solid leadership in uncertain times. And then, with that sweet voice Rebecca had already learned to fear, suggested that perhaps it was time for Rebecca to consider if she was really prepared for the position she held. It wasn't a direct threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a suggestion. But Rebecca understood perfectly. The community was losing confidence in her. And if she didn't react fast, she would lose everything. James Carter was at the local market when he heard the first direct mention of Rebecca's name. Two women were talking in the organic produce aisle, speaking quietly but not quietly enough. They mentioned the CEO, mentioned problems at the company, mentioned it was a shame to see a woman with such potential falling apart under pressure. James felt his jaw tighten. He didn't know Rebecca personally. They had barely exchanged words. But he knew that kind of talk. He knew how rumors spread, how reputations were destroyed, how truths were twisted until they became unrecognizable. And he knew, more than anything, the smell of manipulation. Someone was orchestrating this, and Rebecca was in the crosshairs. Grace came home that afternoon with a drawing she had made at school. It was her and Luke holding hands under a bright yellow sun. James looked at the drawing and felt his chest tighten. His daughter was building a genuine friendship with that boy. And James knew, from everything he had observed, that Luke needed that friendship more than Grace did. But he also knew that if he got involved in Rebecca's problems, he could put his own daughter at risk. He could drag Grace into a situation that had nothing to do with her. And his priority would always be to protect his daughter. Always. But then he looked at the drawing again, at the two smiles drawn in crayon, and wondered, wouldn't protecting Grace also mean protecting her friend? Rebecca was in a tense meeting with the board when she felt control slip completely from her hands. Richard Graves was present, sitting at the back of the room, watching with those cold, calculated eyes. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just asked pointed questions, always about the same distorted reports, always with that tone of professional concern that rang false to anyone paying attention. But the board wasn't paying attention to the tone. They were paying attention to the questions. And every question planted more doubts, more insecurities, more reasons to question Rebecca's leadership. When the meeting ended, she walked out of that room knowing she had lost ground. And she didn't know how to get it back. Luke spent the entire weekend at Grace's house. It was the first time Rebecca allowed her son to stay away so long, and she didn't know if she was doing it because she trusted James or because she was too tired to fight. When she went to pick him up on Sunday night, she saw something that made her stop in the doorway. Luke was in the small kitchen, helping Grace make cookies, both covered in flour, laughing at something James had said. And James was there, present, attentive, participating. There was no phone, no work. Just a normal Sunday afternoon. And Luke looked happy, truly happy. Rebecca felt something break inside her, because she realized her son had never looked like that when he was with her. James noticed Rebecca standing in the doorway and waved for her to come in. She hesitated, but entered, feeling strangely out of place in that simple, welcoming house. Grace ran to greet her, all excited, showing off the cookies they were making. Luke smiled, shy but genuine. And James offered coffee, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Rebecca accepted, not because she wanted coffee, but because she didn't know what else to do. She sat at the small table, holding the cup between her hands, and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to simply breathe. There was no judgment there, no expectations, no pressure. Just a simple family, living simply. And Rebecca realized she had forgotten what that was like. The conversation was casual at first. Grace talked nonstop. Luke added occasional comments. James asked gentle questions. But then, in a moment of silence, James looked directly at Rebecca and asked with disarming sincerity, "Are you okay?" It wasn't a polite question. It was a real question. And Rebecca, too exhausted to lie, simply shook her head. No, she wasn't okay. And saying that out loud, even if only through a gesture, was like releasing a pressure she had been holding for months. James didn't push. He didn't ask more questions. He just nodded, as if he understood. And Rebecca had the strange feeling that maybe he really did understand. When Rebecca and Luke left, James stood in the doorway, watching the car disappear down the street. Grace was by his side, holding his hand, tired but happy. She asked if Luke's mom was sad. James didn't know how to answer. Sad didn't seem like the right word. Lost, maybe. Lonely. Fighting. He crouched down to his daughter's level and said that sometimes people carry weights they can't share with anyone, and that didn't make them bad, just human. Grace thought for a moment and then asked if they could help take off a little of the weight. James smiled, touched his daughter's face tenderly, and said they were already helping. Just by being who they were, just by being present. That night, Rebecca lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. She thought about Graves, about Margaret, the reports, the board. She thought about how she had fought so hard to build that life, that reputation, that empire. And she thought about how, in just a few weeks, everything seemed to be falling apart. But then she thought about something else. She thought about that simple kitchen, about that ex-Marine in flannel, about that girl with the open smile. And she thought about how her son had seemed more alive there, in those few hours, than in months living under her roof. And for the first time, Rebecca allowed herself to question not just if she could save her company, but if it was worth saving something that had never really mattered. And the answer, whispered in the silence of that lonely night, scared her more than any distorted report ever could. James Carter had learned many things during his years in the Marine Corps, but perhaps the most valuable was this: observe first, act later, never the other way around. And in recent weeks, he had observed a lot. He observed Rebecca's behavioral patterns when she passed through the club. He observed the way she gripped her phone too tightly, how her shoulders got tenser and tenser, how the forced smile she offered her son was disappearing completely. He also observed the movements around her, the conversations that stopped when she arrived, the exchanged glances, the atmosphere of judgment that followed her like a shadow. And then, on a Tuesday morning, while waiting for Grace to get out of school, James saw something that confirmed his suspicions. Richard Graves, the man he had discreetly investigated, walking out of the corporate building with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile of someone who had just won a battle. And James knew, in that moment, that Rebecca had no idea what she was facing. The decision to get involved didn't come easily. James spent the entire night awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing the options. He didn't owe Rebecca Hawley anything. He barely knew her. And meddling in her problems could put his own daughter at risk, could drag Grace into a situation that had nothing to do with them. But then he thought of Luke. He thought of the way the boy looked at the world, with that sadness no child should carry. He thought of the way Grace had brought light into his life. And he thought of something his commander used to say: "You don't choose when duty calls. You only choose if you're going to answer." And James knew, deep down, that if he stayed out of it, if he let that woman be destroyed by manipulations he could identify, he would never be able to look at his own daughter again and say he did the right thing. Graves, meanwhile, intensified his siege with the precision of an experienced predator. He knew Rebecca was weakened, that the community was questioning her leadership, that the board was losing confidence. And now it was time to deliver the final blow. He summoned Julia Bennett for another private meeting, this time with a more direct, more threatening tone. He mentioned the reports she had helped prepare, mentioned the inconsistencies that could be traced back to her. He didn't say directly that she would be blamed. He didn't need to. Julia understood perfectly. Either she continued cooperating, or she would be sacrificed when everything fell apart. And when she left that room, Julia was shaking. She knew she had two choices: tell Rebecca the truth and risk losing everything, or keep lying and become an accomplice to something that could completely destroy someone's life. Rebecca felt the weight of the crisis reach a new level when Margaret Holt showed up unannounced at her office. It wasn't a cordial visit, it was an ambush. Margaret brought other members of the Chamber of Commerce with her, all with serious expressions, all with sharp questions. They mentioned the reports, mentioned the community's concerns, mentioned the importance of stable leadership in uncertain times. And then, with that fake compassion Rebecca knew so well, suggested that perhaps it was time for her to consider a temporary leave. For the good of the company, for the good of the community, for her own good. Rebecca listened to everything in silence, nails digging into her palms, breathing controlled only by willpower. And when they left, she finally allowed the mask to fall. She sat in her chair, put her face in her hands, and for the first time in years, she cried. It was at that moment her phone rang. It was an unknown number. Rebecca almost didn't answer, but something made her pick it up. On the other end of the line, a calm, steady, familiar voice, James Carter. He said just a few words. We need to talk about what's happening to you. I know who's behind it. Rebecca stayed silent, her heart beating too hard, too fast. Part of her wanted to hang up. Part of her wanted to scream that she didn't need help, that she could solve it alone, that she had always solved it alone. But another part, a smaller but more honest part, whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time to trust someone. And before she could overthink it, before she could back down, Rebecca heard her own voice saying, "Where?" They met at a small cafe, far from the club, far from the judging eyes of the local elite. Rebecca arrived first, chose a table in the back, away from the windows. When James walked in, she noticed something she had never noticed before. He moved with a spatial awareness that only came from military training. He observed everything, noticed everything. And when he sat across from her, his eyes held no judgment, just understanding. James didn't waste time with formalities. He placed a small notebook on the table and began to speak. He mentioned inconsistencies he had noticed, mentioned Richard Graves's name, mentioned corporate manipulation tactics he recognized from his years dealing with military intelligence. And then he said something that made Rebecca stop breathing. He is planting evidence, distorting information. And you are being isolated on purpose so that when he attacks for real, you have no one to defend you. Rebecca looked at that notebook, at the meticulous notes, at the patterns James had identified, and she felt something break inside her. Not from sadness, not from anger, but from relief. Because someone had seen it, someone had noticed. Someone believed she wasn't crazy, wasn't paranoid, wasn't simply failing. She was being sabotaged. And having that confirmation, coming from a stranger who owed her nothing, was like breathing fresh air after months of suffocating. She asked why he was doing this, why he cared. And James shrugged, with that disarming simplicity she was starting to recognize as genuine, and said, "Because it's the right thing to do. And because my daughter cares about your son, and I care about what matters to her." Meanwhile, Graves was celebrating what he believed to be his imminent victory. He had scheduled an extraordinary board meeting for the following week. He had prepared final reports that painted Rebecca as incompetent, unstable, incapable of leading. He had ensured Julia wouldn't talk. He had fed the rumors in the community, and he had isolated Rebecca from any support she might have. Everything was aligned perfectly. In a matter of days, he would take the control he always believed he deserved. And Rebecca Halley would be just another leader who couldn't handle the pressure. He leaned back in his leather chair, looking out the window at the suburb that would soon be in the palm of his hands, and smiled. He didn't know he was being watched. He didn't know someone had already seen through his tactics. He didn't know there was an ex-Marine on the other side of this war. And he had no idea of the mistake he had made. James and Rebecca talked for hours in that cafe. He showed everything he had discovered. She filled in the gaps he didn't have. Together, they began to assemble a complete picture of the conspiracy. And for the first time in weeks, Rebecca didn't feel alone. She didn't feel small. She felt capable of fighting. But for that, she would need to do something she had never done. Trust. Trust James. Trust the plan he was proposing. Trust that she didn't need to carry everything alone. And when they left that cafe, with the sun already setting on the horizon, Rebecca looked at that man in flannel and worn boots and realized he had something all the executives in expensive suits she knew never had: integrity. And in that moment, she decided that if she was going to fall, she would fall fighting. But she wouldn't fall alone. Julia Bennett also made a decision that night. She was at home, looking in the mirror, seeing her eyes red from crying, hands still trembling with fear. And then she thought of her mother, who always said that a person's character is revealed not by what they do when they are safe, but by what they do when they have something to lose. Julia had a lot to lose: her job, her reputation, maybe even her freedom, if everything Graves had done was discovered and she was seen as an accomplice. But she had more to lose if she looked in the mirror every day knowing she had destroyed someone's life out of cowardice. She picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and called Rebecca. When the CEO answered, Julia said just 3 words that would change everything: "I know everything." The extraordinary board meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon in the main hall of the country club. Richard Graves had chosen that location on purpose. It wasn't just a corporate meeting. It was a public trial, staged before the conservative elite that defined the direction of that community. The chairs were arranged in rows, as if it were a courtroom, and Margaret Holt occupied the front row, alongside other influential members of the Chamber of Commerce. Rebecca arrived alone, pale but firm, holding a folder of documents against her chest like a shield. She knew this was the day that would define everything. Either she would rise, or she would be destroyed. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. Because on the other side of the hall, leaning discreetly against the back wall, was James Carter. And he had a plan. Graves opened the meeting with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. His voice was steady, professional, loaded with fake concern. He spoke about the importance of stable leadership, about the challenges the company faced, about the need to make difficult decisions for the good of all. And then, with the precision of an executioner, he began presenting the reports. Distorted numbers, manipulated conclusions, interpretations that painted Rebecca as incompetent, unstable, incapable. The room went silent. All eyes turned to the CEO, waiting for her defense, waiting for her to crumble. Margaret Holt crossed her arms, satisfied. The board exchanged worried glances, and Graves smiled internally, knowing he was seconds away from conquering everything he ever wanted. It was then that James moved. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked to the front of the room with the posture of someone who had faced situations far more dangerous than that. Everyone turned to look at him, confused, some recognizing the ex-Marine who dined modestly at the club, others wondering what on earth a man in flannel was doing interrupting a corporate meeting. Graves frowned, irritated, and was about to order him to leave when James placed a folder on the table. It wasn't just any folder. It was thick, organized, meticulous. And when he opened it, revealing documents, printed emails, access logs, Graves's expression changed. Because he recognized it. And he knew, in that moment, that he had made a fatal mistake. James began to speak. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen the world burn and still chosen to stand on the right side. He explained with surgical clarity how Graves had manipulated internal information, how he had used his access as director of security to distort reports, plant inconsistencies, isolate Rebecca from any support. He mentioned specific dates, private meetings, emails sent outside business hours, pressures on Julia Bennett, conversations with Margaret Holt that crossed the line between legitimate influence and deliberate conspiracy. And with every fact presented, the room grew tenser, eyes turning from Rebecca to Graves, and doubt starting to crack the facade of certainty he had built so carefully. Graves tried to react. He stood up, tried to interrupt, accused James of being a stranger with no authority to be there, tried to disqualify the evidence as fabrications from someone who understood nothing of corporate business, but his voice had lost its firmness. His hands trembled slightly, and when James, with that unshakable calm, asked if he denied sending the specific emails that were printed there, with date, time, and traceable IP, Graves fell silent. It wasn't a strategic silence. It was the silence of someone who had been cornered. And everyone in the room noticed. Margaret Holt uncrossed her arms, her smile vanishing. The board members began to flip through the documents James had distributed. And Rebecca, for the first time that afternoon, breathed. It was Julia Bennett who delivered the final blow. She was sitting in the corner of the room, shaking, hands clasped in her lap, fighting the fear that had paralyzed her for weeks. But when she saw James exposing everything, when she saw Graves starting to crumble, something inside her broke. Not from weakness, from courage. She stood up, voice trembling at first, but getting stronger with every word, and confirmed everything. Confirmed that Graves had pressured her. Confirmed she had helped manipulate reports under threats. Confirmed that all of it had been orchestrated to bring down Rebecca and put Graves in power. And when she finished speaking, with tears running down her face but her head held high, the silence that took over the room was deafening. The community went into shock. It wasn't just a corporate conspiracy. It was a betrayal of the values they claimed to uphold. Honesty, integrity, justice. Graves had manipulated them all, using their own traditions and social rules as weapons, and they had believed it. They had judged Rebecca without questioning. They had spread rumors without verifying. They had been accomplices, even without knowing. Margaret Holt looked at her own expensive shoes, unable to face Rebecca. Board members began to stand up, some approaching Rebecca to apologize, others demanding explanations from Graves. And the man who minutes earlier controlled that room was now alone, isolated, exposed, exactly as he had done to Rebecca. James didn't wait for thanks. He didn't seek recognition. When he saw the truth had been established, that Rebecca was safe, that justice had been done, he simply nodded to her and started walking toward the exit. Rebecca caught up to him before he reached the door. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at that man who owed her nothing, who would gain nothing by helping her, who had risked his own peace for what was right. And then, with a voice choked with emotion, she whispered two words that carried the weight of everything she had never been able to say. "Thank you. You saved me." James shook his head, with that simple way she was beginning to admire deeply, and said, "No. You saved yourself when you chose to fight. I just showed you the weapons you already had." Outside the club, Grace and Luke were waiting sitting on the wooden bench near the lawn. They had spent the afternoon together, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside, just being kids. When James came out, Grace ran to him, and he picked her up, feeling the weight of the world lift a little. Luke stood up, uncertain, until Rebecca came out right behind. And for the first time, she didn't walk toward her son in a rush. She didn't check her phone. She didn't think about the next meeting. She simply knelt down to his level, hugged him tight, and whispered that she was there, that she would always be there, that she had learned something important. And Luke, surprised at first, relaxed into his mother's arms and hugged back. And in that moment, under the golden sky of dusk, two families that had started as strangers met as something different. Not family by blood, but family by choice, by values, by respect. The night fell over the suburb with the same softness as always, but something had changed. Graves was removed from his position, would face investigations, and his reputation was destroyed in the way he had tried to destroy Rebecca's. Julia received a second chance, under supervision, but also respect for having found courage when it mattered. Margaret Holt and the other members of the elite had to face their own reflections, recognizing they had been manipulated because they wanted to believe the worst. And Rebecca, back in her office, looking out the window at the community that almost destroyed her, but now saw her with new eyes, understood something fundamental. Power didn't come from control. It came from character. Reputation didn't come from appearance. It came from truth. And strength didn't come from never falling. It came from getting up, and from having the courage to accept an outstretched hand when someone offered help. The weeks following the extraordinary meeting brought changes no one in the community could have predicted. Richard Graves was formally removed from his position, facing not only corporate investigations, but also the weight of a destroyed reputation in the only thing that really mattered in that conservative suburb, his word. He had violated trust, manipulated the truth, used his power for selfish ends. And in a community where reputation was built over generations, he had lost everything in a matter of days. The company initiated full audits, discovering layers of manipulation that went beyond what James had exposed. And Rebecca, now with the full support of the board, led every step of the restoration with a clarity that came not from control, but from renewed purpose. Julia Bennett was given a second chance, but it wasn't easy. Rebecca kept her at the company, under direct supervision, because she recognized something fundamental. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to do the right thing despite it. Julia had made mistakes, had given in to pressure, had participated in something that almost destroyed a life. But in the end, when it mattered, she had chosen the truth. And Rebecca, who now understood the weight of vulnerability, decided that redemption was possible for those who truly sought it. Julia worked double time, rebuilding her own reputation with every honest decision, every transparent report, every moment she chose integrity over convenience. And slowly, the community began to see her not as the woman who had fallen, but as the woman who had gotten back up. Margaret Holt faced her own consequences, though more subtle. No one accused her directly of conspiracy, but everyone knew the role she had played. She had spread rumors. She had fed doubts. She had used her influence to pressure Rebecca without verifying the truth. And now, every time she walked into the country club, she felt the weight of the look she used to hand out so easily. Some people still greeted her, because politeness was a rule in that community. But the respect had evaporated. And for a woman who had built her identity on social influence, that was a punishment more severe than any formal lawsuit. She learned the hard way that power without responsibility was poison, and that once lost, trust was the hardest thing to regain. Rebecca returned to the helm of the company, but not as the CEO she had been before. She was still firm, still made tough decisions, still maintained high standards. But now there was something different. She listened more. She delegated with confidence. She recognized when she needed help. And most importantly, she started showing up at home before dinner. She started asking about her son's day. She started putting her phone away during meals. Luke noticed the change before anyone else. At first he was cautious, as if expecting his mother to revert to the old pattern at any moment. But when weeks turned into months and she continued to be present, truly present, something inside him began to heal. And for the first time in his life, he began to believe he had not just a powerful mother, but a mother who loved him enough to choose to be there. The community went through its own transformation. The episode with Graves had exposed an uncomfortable truth. They had allowed appearance to replace substance, status to replace character. They had judged Rebecca for her coldness without knowing her struggle. They had dismissed James for his simplicity without recognizing his integrity. And now, forced to confront their own prejudices, they began to question other assumptions they made. Who else had they judged unfairly? What other truths had they ignored because they didn't fit the narrative they wanted to believe? It wasn't a dramatic change. Small communities don't change overnight. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need. James Carter went back to his simple routine, but now it was impossible to go unnoticed. People who barely noticed his presence before now greeted him with genuine respect. Local veterans sought him out to talk about the service. Parents stopped him to thank him for demonstrating the kind of character they wanted their children to have. He was uncomfortable with the attention, preferred anonymity, but Grace was beaming. She saw her father being recognized for what he had always been, a hero. Not the kind who wore a uniform or received medals, although he had done both things, but the kind who did the right thing when no one was looking, who protected the vulnerable, who stood up for the truth even when it cost something. And for an 8-year-old girl, that was better than any superhero story. Grace and Luke became inseparable. They spent entire afternoons at the playground, doing homework together, creating elaborate games only they understood. Their friendship was living proof that different worlds could meet without either needing to change who they were. Grace remained spontaneous, loud, full of life. Luke remained quiet, thoughtful, careful. But together, they complemented each other. She taught him to laugh more. He taught her to observe more. And when the two families met, as happened with increasing frequency, there was something in the air no one could fully name. It wasn't romance. It wasn't a merger. It was just respect, admiration, recognition that each had something the other needed to learn, and the willingness to learn. Rebecca and James developed a friendship that surprised them both. They had dinner together at the club occasionally, always with the kids, always keeping things appropriate. They talked about parenting, about the difficulties of balancing life and work, about the challenges of rebuilding after everything seemed lost. There were no pretenses between them. She didn't need to prove anything to him. He didn't expect anything from her. It was just two people who had gone through a storm together and come out the other side with mutual respect. Rebecca learned from James the value of simplicity, of presence, of letting go of control. James learned from Rebecca that strength could come in different forms, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that asking for help was as brave as offering it. And both learned that family wasn't just blood, it was choice. One night, months after everything had happened, Rebecca was at the club with Luke when she saw James and Grace walking in. The children ran to each other as they always did, and Rebecca waved for James to join them. While they ate, laughing at a story Grace was telling with exaggerated enthusiasm, Rebecca looked around the table and felt something she hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not the frantic joy of a corporate achievement, not the hollow satisfaction of a defended reputation, but the deep, quiet contentment of being exactly where she was supposed to be, with people who mattered, living in a way that had real meaning. And when her eyes met James's across the table, he nodded, as if he understood, as if he felt it too, as if they both knew they had found something rare, not a fairy tale ending, but something better, an honest beginning. The suburb continued its routine. American flags continued waving on the poles. Families continued walking across the impeccable lawns. But something fundamental had changed. Graves had taught, through his fall, the danger of ambition without ethics. Julia had taught that redemption was possible. Margaret had taught that influence without integrity was empty. Rebecca had taught that true strength came from vulnerability. And James had taught that character mattered more than anything else. They weren't lessons shouted or proclaimed. They were lessons lived, demonstrated, embodied. And as the sun set over that small conservative community, casting golden shadows over the country club where it all began, one truth remained crystal clear. Power could open doors, but only integrity could build homes. Status could buy attention, but only presence could create love. And in the end, when everything else faded away, what remained was simple: family, truth, honor, and the courage to choose what is right, no matter the cost.